Draco walked through the halls of Hogwarts, his mind still preoccupied with thoughts of you. He arrived at the potions classroom early, hoping to have a moment to himself before class started. He took a seat at one of the desks, his eyes darting around the room as he waited for the other students to arrive. A group of boys walked into the classroom, chatting amongst themselves. Draco's ears perked up as he heard your name mentioned in their conversation.
Yeah, she's Snape's daughter. But damn, she's hot. I wish I could...
Yeah, me too. But I'd be too scared to even talk to her. She's like Snape, only worse.
Draco's irritation flared at the boys' crude comments. He had to admit, he found you attractive too, but he didn't like the way they were talking about you. He clenched his fists, his jaw set tight. "Shut up," he muttered under his breath. Draco smirked at the boys, noticing their sudden silence. It was clear that he had intimidated them, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room as more students began to arrive. He couldn't wait to see you again, even if it meant having to endure a potions class with you. Draco's heart skipped a beat as you entered the classroom with your father. He tried to act nonchalant, but he couldn't help but notice how striking you looked. He watched as you and Snape made your way to the front of the room, and he felt a mix of nervousness and excitement at the thought of being in the same room with you for the next hour. The room was filled with a tense silence as everyone in the room stared at you, their eyes fixed on your every move. Draco tried to focus on anything but you, but he found himself stealing glances in your direction. He couldn't help but notice the way you interacted with your father, the subtle way you leaned in to speak to him, the way he seemed to listen intently to your every word. The whole class was captivated by your presence. Your dark hair framed your face perfectly, your eyes as deep and dark as night. Your skin was smooth and flawless, like porcelain, contrasting starkly with your pink lips. Everyone in the room was drawn to your beauty, yet they dared not to speak or approach, their gazes following you with reverence and caution. The class watched as you took your seat next to Tom Riddle, the two of you exuding an air of authority and power. Draco couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy at the sight of you sitting next to Riddle. He knew that Riddle was just as dangerous and feared as Snape, and he wondered if you were just as ruthless and cunning. Snape's voice cut through the silence, announcing the lesson for the day.
Today we will be attempting something new and relatively easy. His gaze sweeping over the class. An aging potion.
The class perked up at the announcement, some students looking excited while others looked nervous. Draco's mind immediately went to you, wondering how you would handle the potion.
Snape continued his explanation. An aging potion is a potion that, depending on the amount taken, can temporarily age the drinker to different ages. He paused, his gaze settling on a few students who looked particularly nervous. It's important to note that the effects of the potion are temporary and will wear off after a couple of hours, so no need to worry about becoming permanently older or younger. Snape looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the students. "Can anyone tell me the ingredients to the aging potion?" he asked, his voice commanding and authoritative. The class remained silent for a moment, the students looking down at their books and trying to remember. "Keep your books closed," he shouted, his tone sharp and impatient. "No looking in your books until I say so. This is a test of your memory, not your reading skills." Snape's gaze shifted to you as your hand shot up, a hint of disappointment in his eyes at the lack of response from the other students. "Yes, Miss Snape," he said, his tone a little softer than before. The class watched in awe as you rattled off the list of ingredients confidently and swiftly. Snape's eyebrows raised, impressed at your knowledge. "Correct," he said, his tone a little more agreeable now. "Well done, Miss Snape." Snape's stern expression softened as he looked at you, a hint of pride in his eyes. He couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at your intelligence and confidence. "Very good. It seems my daughter has inherited my brains." Snape's gaze shifted back to the rest of the class, his irritation returning as he noticed some students still not paying attention. "Take out your books and start learning the potion," he barked, his tone sharp once again. "This is not a game, and I expect everyone to take this seriously." Snape's gaze fixed on Ron and Harry, who were giggling in the corner, clearly not taking the lesson seriously. "Mr. Weasley, Mr. Potter," he said, his tone sharp and authoritative. "Is there something amusing about the aging potion?"
"No, sir," he said weakly, trying to look serious.
The class rustled with the sound of pages turning as everyone opened their books and began reading about the aging potion. The mood in the room was a mix of intensity and anticipation, with everyone focused on trying to memorize the steps and ingredients for the potion. Draco occasionally glanced up at you, admiring your concentration and focus on the task at hand. Draco's heart skipped a beat when you briefly made eye contact with him, but he quickly looked away when he noticed you turned back to your book. He tried to focus on the potion instructions in front of him, but he couldn't help but steal a glance in your direction every so often.
Snape stood by his desk, his eyes scanning the room as he observed the students reading their books. He noticed Draco's wandering eyes darting between the book and you. It was clear that the boy was struggling to focus on his work, and Snape found it amusing to see him so distracted. "Something interesting in your book, Mr. Malfoy?" Snape asked sardonically.
Draco looked up at Snape, trying to hide his distraction. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice a little shaky. "These ingredients are interesting, but, what does any of this have to do with aging?"
"Can anyone explain how these ingredients contribute to the aging effect of the potion?" he asked, his tone challenging. Snape waited for a response, but the class was silent. None of the students dared to speak up, their heads bowed over their books as they tried to avoid his gaze. Snape let out a frustrated sigh. "No one," he repeated, his tone growing impatient. Snape looked towards you, his gaze hopeful now. The class listened in awe as you spoke, your confident and intelligent voice echoing throughout the room. Snape watched with pride, his expression softening as he observed the class react to your answer. "Very good," Snape said, his tone now more proud than impatient. "Miss Snape is correct. The aging potion's ingredients hold a metaphorical significance, representing the different stages of life. Well done."
Ron whispered under his breath. "Of course she's smart. She's Snape's daughter," his tone dripping with envy and irritation. He turned to Hermione, his expression smug. "How come you didn't know that?" he asked, his tone mocking.
Hermione's irritation flared at Ron's comment, her eyes narrowing as she shot him a glare. "I do know that," she snapped, her voice sharp. "I just didn't feel the need to show off."
Harry chimed in, his voice amused. "No, you didn't," he said, glancing at Hermione with a smirk.
Hermione rolled her eyes, her irritation growing by the minute. "Shut up, Harry," she snapped, her voice curt.
Draco overheard the conversation and couldn't help but smirk at the tension between the three friends. He found it amusing to see them arguing over something so trivial.
Snape's gaze swept across the class, his expression stern and authoritative. "You will pair up in groups of 2 for this exercise," he announced, his voice firm. "Girls with girls, boys with boys."
Draco's ears perked up at Snape's words, and he found himself watching you discreetly, curious to see who you would partner up with.
As the class dispersed to find pairing partners, you approached Hermione, who looked eager to work with you. Hermione's face lit up as she saw you walking towards her, and she quickly waved you over. "Hey, do you want to partner up?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Hermione's cheeks flushed at your compliment, her eyes widening in surprise. "Oh, really?" she said, her voice a little flustered. "Your father said that about me?" Hermione's eyes widened further, her cheeks turning a deeper shade of red at your words. "Oh, wow," she said, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "The most brilliant student, really?" She was clearly taken aback by your comment, and it showed in her surprised yet flattered expression. Hermione couldn't help but return your smile, her initial surprise turning into excitement as you worked together. "So, where should we start?" she asked, already pulling out her notes and supplies. Hermione nodded, watching as you headed towards the cabinet to fetch the ingredients. She patiently waited beside the cauldron, her notes and supplies spread out on the desk.
Draco, who had paired up with Riddle, had been keeping an eye on you throughout the class. As he saw you walking towards the cabinet, he made a swift decision to leave his partner behind. He quickly excused himself, mumbling something to Riddle about needing to grab something, before discreetly following you towards the cabinet.
Riddle, noticing Draco's intention to follow you, quickly grabbed his arm and stopped him. "Draco, wait," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not a good idea to go after her."
"Why not?" Draco asked, his expression irritated as he tried to shake off Riddle's grip.
Riddle's grip on Draco's arm tightened, his eyes darting around the room to make sure no one was paying attention to their conversation. "Because she's Snape's daughter," he said, his voice hushed. "You know how protective he is of her. If he sees you trying to get close to her, he'll have your head."
Draco's expression soured at Riddle's words, his expression annoyed. "I don't care," he said, his voice defiant. "I'm not afraid of Snape."
Riddle's grip tightened even more, his expression growing stern. "You should be," he said firmly. "You know what he's capable of. And if he catches you even looking at her the wrong way, you'll regret it."
Draco frowned, his stubborn nature refusing to back down. "I can handle Snape," he said, his voice confident. "I'm not scared of him."
Riddle's face showed skepticism at Draco's arrogance as he reminded him of your new status. "Have you forgotten that she's also a prefect now?" he said. "She takes rule-breaking very seriously and won't hesitate to report you if you do anything stupid."
Draco's confident smile returned as he responded to Riddle's question. "Of course not," he said, his voice cocky. "I never do anything stupid."
Riddle rolled his eyes, clearly not buying it. "Right," he said sarcastically, his grip on Draco's arm still firm. "You never do anything stupid. That's why you're always getting detention." Riddle let out a heavy sigh, resigning to the fact that Draco refused to listen. He released his grip on Draco's arm with a frown and said, "Fine, go ahead. But don't say I didn't warn you."
Draco smirked, feeling a sense of triumph despite Riddle's warning. "Thanks, mate," he said, a hint of mockery in his voice before he quickly made his way towards the cabinet. His expression determined as he spotted you carefully gathering the ingredients required. He approached you discreetly and offered to help carry the items. "Hey," he said, his voice low, "let me carry some of those for you." Draco smirked and shrugged, undeterred by your polite refusal. "I don't mind helping," he insisted, taking half the items from your hands before you could protest. Despite your initial reluctance, you found yourself following after Draco as he carried half of the ingredients. He looked pleased with himself, his smirk still present on his face. "See? I can be helpful," he said, his tone playfully arrogant.
Hermione's gaze darkened as she spotted Draco following behind you, her irritation growing. She turned to him, her expression stern. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Get lost, Draco."
Draco smirked at Hermione's harsh tone, not intimidated by her hostility. He replied with a hint of sarcasm. "I'm just here to offer my assistance," he said, gesturing towards the ingredients he was carrying. As Hermione continued to glare at him, Draco decided to provoke her even further by mentioning Riddle. "Oh, and by the way," he said, his tone now more teasing, "Riddle was saying how he wished it was him here helping you instead."
Hermione scoffed, her irritation visible in her narrowed eyes and clenched jaw. She was used to Draco's attempts at bothering her, but mentioning Riddle was adding salt to the wound. "Of course he did," Hermione said coldly. "Is that the best you could come up with?"
Draco continued to smirk as he nodded towards where Riddle was sitting, his expression smug. "I'm not kidding," he said, his voice filled with mockery. "Riddle has been trying to partner up with you for weeks. He's practically drooling over you."
Hermione's eyes widened at Draco's words, her irritation turning into surprise. She looked over at Riddle, who was indeed watching the two of you from a distance. A mix of annoyance and uncertainty crossed her face. "Why would you even say that?" she snapped at Draco, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and disbelief.
He just smiled, enjoying the effect his words had on her. "Because it's the truth," he replied, his tone unapologetic.
Hermione, still irritated by Draco's words but trying to maintain her composure, reminded him of Snape's instructions. "Snape said we're supposed to be working in pairs of girls and boys," she said firmly. "I can't just change partners because Riddle wants to work with me."
Draco noticed your gaze on him, and he met your eyes with a smirk. He could sense your curiosity, but he didn't say anything, simply holding your gaze for a moment before looking away.
Snape, who had been observing the class, walked up to Draco and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Draco tensed slightly, realizing he had been caught. "Mr. Malfoy," Snape said, his voice stern. "Care to explain why you're over here instead of with your partner?"
Draco, caught off guard by Snape's question, quickly came up with an excuse. "I was just helping the new student," he said, gesturing towards you.
"I can assure you, Mr. Malfoy, that my daughter is more than capable of handling herself in potions class," he said, his voice firm. "She doesn't need your assistance."
"Of course, sir," he said, trying to sound humble. Draco, realizing that he had no choice but to return to his original partner, reluctantly made his way back to Riddle. He slumped down on the chair next to him, his expression a mix of disappointment and annoyance.
Riddle, clearly amused by the entire situation, couldn't help but chuckle at Draco's failed attempt to get closer to you. "I told you so," he said, his voice filled with mockery. "You should have known better than to try that with Snape's daughter."
Draco grumbled, his pride wounded by Riddle's words. "Shut up," he muttered, crossing his arms and looking away. Despite his initial failure, Draco was not ready to give up easily. He turned to Riddle, his expression determined. "I need another way to talk to her," he said, his voice lowered so others wouldn't overhear. "Any suggestions?"
"You really want my help?" he asked, a hint of mockery in his voice. Riddle chuckled at Draco's insistence, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're obsessed, mate," he said, his voice both amused and bewildered. "She's Snape's daughter, and you're a Malfoy. It's never going to happen."
"I don't care," Draco snapped back, his determination unyielding. "I'm going to find a way." Throughout the rest of the class, Draco's gaze kept drifting towards you. He was clearly preoccupied with thoughts of how to approach you later, his mind working overtime to come up with a plan. He barely paid attention to the lesson, his focus solely on you. He occasionally made eye contact with you, quickly looking away when you noticed, his cheeks tinged with a slight blush. He fidgeted in his seat as he impatiently waited for the class to end.